For history teachers like Lucia Harvey, keeping up with developments in their subject is important, and today she's on a mission to update her professional knowledge. She's going to explore two important periods of war in history, which, although hugely different and 700 years apart, both have contemporary relevance, as well as controversial new interpretations. First, she'll hear an expert on the Crusades, talking about the need for historians today to revise old understandings of this period in the context of our modern world and its wars. Then she's going to leap ahead to World War II to update herself on the recent debate about who really won the Battle of Britain. First stop is St John's Gate in London, once a base for Crusaders in the 12th and 13th centuries.
Hi, are you Jonathan?
Yes, and you're Lucia?
That's
right, and you've come to see the gate?
Jonathan Riley-Smith from the University of Cambridge is an international expert on the Crusades. He believes that the accepted views of the Crusades have been used by both Western historians and Islamic scholars to explain or justify holy wars, and that it's time for a rethink.
As important as what happened in the past is what people think happened in the past. It is never too late to confront the reality of the past, because it's only through that facing up to reality that we can really find out about ourselves.
They start off with a brief update on interpretations of the Crusades to date.
The origins of the Western traditions on the Crusades, which permeate everything still, lie in two books written by two very influential men of the early 19th century, Sir Walter Scott and his novel The Talisman, and Joseph-François Michaud's 6-volume history of the Crusades, which of course is completely different from Scott's.
Total.
But
difference.
Totally different. Now, what Scott set up was a tradition in which the Crusaders were rough primitives breaking into and, to some extent, wrecking a culture superior to their own. Michaud's was, on the other hand, nationalistic, imperialistic, glorifying the Crusaders.
I'm interested to sort of understand whether there was a sort of rebirth or reinvention of the Crusades in the 19th century.
In the 1920s and 1930s, the Crusades were reinterpreted by liberal economic historians who took all the ethos out of them and said, oh, there was no religion involved. These were after money, profit, gain, territory. Once the Crusades had been stripped of their ethos, you could then add the Walter Scott tradition in. So you then have these primitive, barbaric sort of rugby players bursting into a civilization superior to them, but nevertheless, at the same time, proto-colonialists and empire builders.
Yeah.
And that is, if you like, the public perception of Crusades to this day.
So how has this Western perception been adopted by Arab nationalists and Islamic scholars?
In the 1890s, Sultan Abdul Hamid II, he said, the Europeans have started the Crusades again. And here he simply followed all that rhetoric that the imperialists had been using, is that using a new set of weapons, if you like, commerce, trade, banking, and all the rest of it, the Europeans had re-embarked on the Crusades. This was picked up by a new pan-Islamic movement, and in particular by the great ideologue who was a man called Sayyid Qutb, an Egyptian. And Sayyid Qutb evolved a theory in which behind almost every act of aggression against Islam, be it Zionist, communist, imperialist, lay what he called Crusaderism. Anywhere where the West infiltrates Islam and Western values permeate Islam. This is Crusaderism. Osama bin Laden constantly refers to Crusades. It's a historical vision, it's a moral vision. It justifies the measures the jihadis take against us because they're only fighting back defensively, in their eyes, against a force, a crusading force. Our problem is that our own society has no answer other than to say, oh, dear, yes, well, I mean, you know, they were absolutely terrible things and we're very sorry for them. To say sorry to the Muslims for the Crusades is like a man with a Kalashnikov firing off rounds and shouting over the rounds that he's terribly sorry for his ancestors' use of a bow and arrow. Because, in fact, all the Muslims think is that the Crusades are continuing.
If these accepted views of the Crusades still abound, that they were essentially profiteering aggression by proto-colonialists, how then should historians be revising their thinking now?
Turning to what the Crusades were really about, one has to start by pointing out that for centuries they were something that the leaders of the church approved of. And that raises an issue which is generally forgotten, which is that the Muslims genuinely frightened people. And there was a belief that Christendom required defending. It should always be remembered, it's generally forgotten, that when Christianity is aggressive, it sends out missions. When it's defensive, it fights crusades. And crusades themselves fit into Christian traditions of holy or just war, which still prevail today. That is the first point to make. The second is this. It's quite wrong to think of crusades as being specifically anti-Islamic. Crusades were fought against Muslims, of course, but they were also fought in the Baltic against the pagan Balts, in Western Europe against heretics, even against Catholic opponents of the church. And thirdly, it is now beyond any question, without any doubt, that crusading to the East was not profitable. Why did they do it? The answer is increasingly clear. You are faced with a true devotional exercise.
Yeah.
There are the most appalling events during crusades and before crusades. That's true. But that is true, I'm afraid, of all religious wars, not just crusades. And true, incidentally, of all ethical violence. Liberal democracy, humanitarianism. There are enormous dangers in it. But until we recognize crusading for what it was, we cannot see those dangers. And we cannot see that those dangers are here with us now.
Jonathan Riley-Smith has argued that historians need to rethink their understanding of wars fought hundreds of years ago if we are to really understand our modern world and its current wars. With these sobering thoughts, Lucia now turns to a 20th century war story that's recently had some controversial history headlines. Her second stop is the RAF Museum in North London, where she's going to get her head round the recent debate about who really won the Battle of Britain.
You must be Andrew.
Andrew Lambert from King's College London will be her guide.
This is the RAF Museum's Battle of Britain Hall, where they've got all the historic aircraft from the Battle of Britain in the early days of the Second World War.
Wow, it's very impressive, isn't it?
It is. I thought this would be a really good place to come and discuss the events of 1940, to try and put them into context.
So what's new about the Battle of Britain? I mean, surely it's about Spitfires and RAF pilots.
It is, but we need to think of a wider context, and like everything in history, we need to see how the story evolves. We need to see how interpretations change. The received wisdom really is that the RAF took on the Luftwaffe, the most successful air force in the world, defeated it in battle in the skies of southern Britain, and then the Germans didn't invade Britain. But we really need to think about that some more.
So let me put you on the spot for a second. Who do you think won the Battle of Britain? Was it the RAF or the Navy, or was it the Army?
Probably answer that in a slightly roundabout way by saying it's probably Churchill. Churchill defines the Battle of Britain. He says, France, battle over, Britain, battle begins. And by setting out the parameters of how we discuss the subject, as he does with the whole of the Second World War, we think about the Second World War in Churchill's terms. He defines this, he makes those great speeches, he talks about the few, never has so much been owed. He gives us the rhetoric, the images. He's the Prime Minister, he's also the chief speech writer, he's his own spin doctor. And he creates the Battle of Britain at the start. He sets up this arena in which the events will be played out. He chooses who he wants to represent Britain in this story, and he chooses the RAF. The RAF is brand new. It's only been in existence for 30 years. 1st of April 1918, RAF. This is their first great strategic battle, their first chance to be the lead force over all the other forces, not supporting the Army and Navy, out there on their own, fighting for command of the air. And it's their day in the shop window, and they make the most of it. The role of the RAF is to make it look like the Luftwaffe can't do the job.
Yeah.
And that's humiliating. And so Air Marshal Goering, who's saying, I can do it, I can bomb the British and they'll give up, he loses face, he loses status in the Nazi regime. We have Churchillian rhetoric, the Royal Air Force successful in the air, and of course above all, we haven't even mentioned the Navy.
I was just about to ask that, in fact. I mean, what was the role of the Navy at this point?
The Royal Navy is fully mobilised, ready for war, and it's stationed in just the right positions. It's the largest navy in the world. It's got 70 or 80 destroyers, 40 cruisers, 10 or a dozen battleships. Really, the best thing the Germans could have done for the British was to try this invasion, to put all their troops into ships, send them to sea, and get them sunk.
Right.
And Hitler knows this. The idea that the Germans could bulldoze their way through this, ignore what the Navy could do, land on the beaches, defeat this very large army, even if the RAF didn't win the Battle of Britain in the air, the chances of the Germans invading are actually quite slim. The invasion is far too risky. If it fails, they will have lost their army, they'll have lost their reputation, and public relations is very important. This aura of invincibility that the Luftwaffe and the Germans have achieved is worth a lot to them. They don't want to be seen to lose. So when the Battle of Britain turns against them, instead of fighting it to the finish, they switch targets. They say, we'll not do this anymore, this is dangerous. The great thing about looking at these questions now is we can distance ourselves from the events of the time in the way they had to be presented, the things that had to be said and done because there was a war on, and now we can ask those questions that might have seemed a little bit rude at the time. You know, was it really not all the RAF? Well, no, it wasn't all the RAF. What the RAF did was brilliant, but if we see it in a bigger picture, we understand how the past works much better. So instead of saying the RAF won the Battle of Britain, we need to say Britain won the Battle of Britain, that all the British Armed Forces played their role in this.